Introduce me to the child you were. Maybe still are, but the child you were. Where did you grow up?
Well, I like to put it in other terms. Donald Trump grew up 2 blocks from me.
Okay.
I grew up on Kruger Road in Jamaica Estates. That was an upper middle class, by and large, well-educated, maybe up, an educational class, probably above what it was in financial class, but it was a fairly wealthy neighborhood. My neighbors were predominantly, though not by no means exclusively Jewish. Doctors, lawyers.
That wasn't your family, was it?
My father was a professor. He taught Latin American history at City College. And we were very eccentric. I wouldn't have known that term maybe at the time, but we were very different from the rest of the neighborhood. For example, we had a house decorated with some combination. I remember there were cheap rugs, kind of comparable to what we're standing on here, that were woven out of scrap wool,
okay.
Right? But the house was decorated with all of these things brought back from the far ends of the world. Beautiful Portuguese porcelain, South American chachkas, serapes on the bed, etc. And so it didn't look at all, like any of my friends' homes.
It didn't look presentable, maybe.
I think it didn't to me, right? To a more educated eye, it was far more interesting than the decorator furnished houses and flats.
It was more Greenwich Village than Queens.
Sorry?
It was more Greenwich Village than Queens.
Well, it may, yes and no. That is, my parents, to my memory, never lived in Greenwich Village. I think because my father taught uptown.
Right.
Wish I could remember the address. It's 180 something well uptown. I remember we passed that once, and my father said, "We lived there somewhat before you were born," or something. I said, "Oh, I know that place." He said, "How you know that? We lived there before you were born." I said, "Bob Jacobson lived there. He held a party 6 months ago." that kind of thing.
Is it fair to call them humanists, not scientists, your parents?
Well, yes, absolutely. And my father's major work is a book called Latin American Civilization, Colonial Period. And most of what I learned about what he did came from his own memorial service. And what I was told, which contrasted sharply with the political person I knew largely from disagreement, he on the right, I on the left, when I was young, was that he found two important things, but one in particular about Latin America, that what we would now call multiculturalism, that it was a combination of native civilization invading European civilization and imported African civilization. The other point is less relevant to left-right issues, and that's the difference between the Portuguese Brazil and all of the Spanish-inspired countries.
So you were on the left early, precociously. He was on the right.
Well, I don't know whether it's precocious or not. I was on the left from the time I was an early mid-teenager.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, I've said to other interviewers that I grew up among red diaper babies.
Right.
My first girlfriend, well, no, not quite first, but yeah, my first 2 girlfriends were both from communist families, and the second one's father had fought in the Spanish Revolutionary War, fought with the Lincoln Battalion.
I'm interested to know whether it's on left-right politics or whether it's humanism and a growing interest in technology, how your parents dealt with you as clearly self-directed, intense young man. Were you encouraged? Were you told to go other directions that you wanted to go? What was their spirit of parenthood?
No, I think I was encouraged. I have naturally lots of complaints about my parents,
yeah.
But one of the things they did, both of them, was to devote a lot of time to doing things with me. So I was scientifically interested. My mother, I remember this only from what my mother told me some years later, but she said she was taken to task by my kindergarten teacher for having pumped my head full of science. Well, she certainly, she protested she didn't do that. She didn't know any of the things except she may have read them to me.
Right.
I was read to a great deal. But my father took me to the Bronx Zoo, to the Museum of Natural History, every weekend, that sort of thing. We did just lots of that for a decade or so.
So I think there's some inkling of the young cryptologist emerging in your...
Well, we can get back to that, and we can get to my mother.
Yes, please.
Now, my mother my mother died in January '61, so I know her less well than my father, who died 20 years later. But my mother is co-author with my father on, for example, Latin American civilization. I don't know what she did, because I can never detect she had any interest in the subject. I thought for a while that she taught him how to write. She was she was an historian of Madame de Sévigné, who is the foremost source of social history of the courts of Louis XIII and XIV. Yeah. Her work on that was never published. She might have had an article in the New Yorker, except the editor changed at just the wrong moment, and the new editor wasn't interested, and she was paid for it, but it was never run. And then she died before the book she was writing was published. But my perception actually is my father wrote better than my mother, so I don't know how to square these two things. Of course, students are sometimes better than their teachers. At any event, the two of them are both fundamentally historians, and I don't know what more, how does this come to cryptography? It's not clear whether it bears very much on the cryptography.
It may not. I mean, there's no inevitability, I think, about any life, actually. But at some point, I've got to get you interested in science, and I've got to get you on your way as a scientist.
All right, so I was interested in science apparently from the time I was at least, no later than 5.
Right.
Now, my life has a landmark in it that I think is very influential, which is that a few days after my 4th birthday, we went to Portugal and spent the year. And I think that may be the reason that I have a lot more young memories than most people do. I have very few before that. I can have a memory of standing on the front lawn when I was 3 in a yellow raincoat, things like that. And I have a memory, maybe fabricated, my father thought I couldn't possibly remember it, of being carried on my father's shoulders to the poll to go vote. And he said, "But you were 2. Right? Not
Henry
possible.
James had exactly the same kind of memory at about the same age. But anyway.
So what exactly led me to be interested in science initially, I don't know.
Yes,
but apparently, I like that sort of thing. My first exposure to cryptography, and everybody has asked about this, the first I remember, is that I had a 5th grade teacher named Mary Collins. I was not able to find her after I tried for people like Stephen Levy wrote, she reads this, would she get in touch? But I think she's surely dead by now. She'd be 20 years, 25 older than I am. She taught us one day about cryptography when I was in 5th grade. And I got interested in the subject, and my father brought me an armful of books from the City College Library. And I read the children's books. I never read Helen Gaines' Cryptanalysis. I haven't read it yet, but it was the one serious book. Lots of people were inspired by that book in this set. And I thought about this for about 2 weeks, formed the impression that a transposed Vigenère was, probably great, and didn't think about the matter again for years. And I was very interested as a teenager in military subjects, but I'm a snob. And so I wasn't interested in things I thought everybody was interested in. I thought intelligence and cryptography, that was much too popular. I knew about poison gas and map making and medieval fortifications and a variety of things that, were harder to find out about. There was less around about them. And then the subject, stuck in the back of my mind. And at MIT, I learned occasional things about it.
Before I let you go to MIT, I
Okay.
want to know what kind of a student you were in high school.
Lousy.
lousy.
I was a lousy student everywhere. I have many virtues, I believe, being a good student, which I respect tremendously. Right? And for example, I applied to be an astronaut, and they wisely didn't hire me and hired a graduate student from the physics department. What's most famous of the women died about 5 years ago of cancer. Sorry?
Sally Ride?
Yeah, Sally Ride. And but you know, to be an astronaut, you need to be a good student because you get assigned work to do that you don't control.
And nobody ever accused you of being a good student?
Well, nobody ever accused me of it, but I don't plead guilty. That way.
Right. So in high school, you're not doing a good job.
Well, you know,
that's why I wouldn't let you go to MIT yet. So you're a lousy student in high school. How do you wind up at MIT?
Okay, so I think the world was more forgiving at that time. I was a lousy student. I think probably I had an 89 average. You know, good students had a 97, 98, right. 99 average. So I did very well reasonably well on I would now call it on the tests, you know, 750, 770 or something on the SATs. There was one. I was just thinking as I was walking in here walking toward the building about the merit exam and how I completely didn't understand that exam, and got to go back and see if a woman named Ellen Cohen, who was the valedictorian, and for many years I felt was the smartest person I'd ever known. Right, that's a title that dissolves in a lifetime of knowing Nobel Prize winners and such. But she did very well on the merit exam, and I did just dreadfully. I always wondered, and never really understood it. So, how did I get into MIT? Well, partly that I did well in the exams. Maybe partly that I did well with the interviewer, though I was 10 minutes late to the interview because I got out of the subway station and walked 5 blocks in the wrong direction. And I asked to be admitted early to MIT. There was some formal procedure that I didn't know. I just wrote and asked them, said I wanted to go there. I would, drop it, and they wrote to me 2 months before everything else and said you're in. And I don't know what else to
Well, they were
tell
the
you.
ones who made the decision. So
Well, they're the ones who made the decision. Go interview them.
You got in.
Right, I got in.
So, what are you going to study at MIT?
Now I should back up a little. Mathematics. I thought from the time I was 12 or so that I was a mathematician.
Okay.
And I can identify, I don't know exactly why. Partly it's that in 7th grade, I was doing well in mathematics, and I was humiliated. The last topic we did in the year, there was no exam on it, was graphs. And I didn't understand at all. All my graphs came out as straight lines like this, and that's because I didn't understand you weren't supposed to scale the axes. Right? And over the summer, I was terrified that I was going to be discovered, this idiot who didn't, and I began studying that, and I think that's probably the first I began practicing mathematics. I came, I don't know how close, but closer than not at all to discovering calculus, right? To seeing those problems and all doing it in terms of graph plotting and things of that kind. Then I read Heinlein's book Rolling Stones, in which there's a grandmother who believes that mathematics is the guide to all of science and technology. With a lot to be said for her point of view. And at any end, it would be 13 or 14 or 15, maybe as late as 15 now, I read Eric Temple Bell's Men of Mathematics. And boy, I could talk for an hour about this.
Well, basically the mathematician is going to get ruined and become a computer scientist. So
all right, I can get to that, right? And but the critical point was one of the things that interests me is that I had no realistic model of the career of a mathematician. Right? I imagined I'd become a professor or something like that. But since I wasn't a very good student and didn't study very hard and didn't do very well and didn't get into graduate school and had to dodge the draft, right? So
Right.
I wouldn't have foreseen. I curiously ended up fulfilling a dream that I expressed when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know. I wanted to be a great scientist in a great industrial laboratory. And I imagined chemistry or something like that,
Yeah, yeah.
bubbling pots. But the point is, one of my early visions was of being an industrial scientist. The kind of person you might see in science fiction films, working on this, that, or the
Right.
other, which may turn out.
But I don't want you to get happy yet, because MIT
Oh,
is
what?
not an entirely happy experience for you when you're there. I mean, again, maybe high school wasn't either, but
Oh, and high school was a great experience.
high school was great.
Absolutely, not because it was high school so much, as because this aforementioned Ellen Cohen. I went to Jamaica High School because my guidance teacher in junior high said, if you go to one of the specialized high schools like Bronx Science, you'll never have any friends because your friends will be all over the city and you'll never see them. Right? And I thought that was good advice, and we all passed the exam for Bronx Science, and my close friends all went, and I went to Jamaica High.
And missed meeting Marty Hellman.
No, I didn't meet. Yeah, I missed meeting.
No,
Marty
I'm just
Hellman's
kidding, because
2
he
years
was at
younger.
Bronx
Yeah, I
Science.
might not have met him. He's 2 years younger than I am.
Oh, I see.
But
in any case.
that's not. I mean, yeah, we would have overlapped. But no, what happened is, in the first week or two of Jamaica High, this aforementioned Ellen Cohen introduced me to the ethical culture youth groups, which met on Friday night at the Ethical Building up next to Central Park.
Right.
And from then on, my friends were from all over the city. My girlfriend lived on the Lower East Side. But the fact is, I saw them all the time. There was a party circuit that started with Friday night at Ethical, and typically had a party on Saturday night, and in good weather met in Washington Square for folk singing on Sunday afternoon.
Okay, so you're happy.
All right,
in
so
high
I did
school.
very well. And I didn't do very well. I didn't like MIT at all. I like
Yes,
it much
that's-
better now than I did then.
Yeah, and what was not
two-
working for you at MIT?
2 or 3 things. One, MIT was almost all men at that time, had the atmosphere of Boy Scout camp or something. 2, it was a rightist organization. The real people, as I viewed it, were on the left.
Yes.
And so I wasn't happy with the politics at MIT. I wasn't happy with the male atmosphere at MIT. It drew on. I'm very easily distracted and happy to sit and talk all night and things like that. So I was easily drawn into effectively relative to studying, wasting a great deal of time. And so I didn't do very well as a student, and that's part of the reason I wasn't very happy.
How close did you come to not getting a degree?
Very. I had to go back. I flew back from New York in the sort of last week between the end of exams and graduation to turn in something or other. I graduated with the minimal number of points, and if I hadn't passed that class, I think I wouldn't have graduated.
Okay, so you get out.
And I don't know where I ranked. I don't know it anymore. I believe I ranked very low out of the 900 or so people in my class.
Another one of the interviewees I've had in this series, Alan Kay, was also a terrible student and got kicked out of everywhere. So
maybe you did worse than I did. I didn't have the courage to get kicked out.
So, but you're now in science.
Well, incidentally, Alan Kay and I may have something in common. I don't know Alan. I know him and know him a long time, but don't know him that well. But I think that if I'm strong in anything, it's imagination. I don't consider myself especially smart. That's of course ridiculous in one sense, but I mean, relative to Marty or some of the other people we call it, smart is not my virtue, it's imaginative.
Yeah.
And that
I
I think was the contribution to my partnership with Marty and to a variety of other things, and that's unquestionably Alan Kay's contribution.
Unquestionably. So you're beginning to be in science and industry. How do I get you to meet not only Marty, but the process that would lead to your great insights?
So I went to, at MITRE, I was supported to work at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT on symbolic mathematical manipulation. In that process, I decided that formal proof of correctness of programs was the most important problem in modern engineering. The person who understood that was John McCarthy. And John McCarthy came around and I talked to him and he hired me. I mean, there's more complexity, but that occurred in the summer through the fall of 1969.
Okay.
And so I moved out here and I started working for John McCarthy on a combination of system programming, which was the vehicle in some sense, right? I was interested in proofs. I was doing the thing I wanted to do proofs about, and proof checking and theory of what the Russians call theory of programming. I was rescued from this, and I say that because that field, however important, has not done, right? It's made much less progress. My presence in it would not have made some grand difference in that field. It's still, it's made a certain amount of progress, but it is not the day-to-day tool of programmers. That's why programming is in such rotten shape. In the August 1972, Larry Roberts, who hasn't died yet, unlike Bob Taylor, sorry. Larry Roberts went to see Howard Rosenblum. Larry Roberts was funding the ARPANET. Howard Rosenblum was, at NSA, he was either deputy director for ComSec or deputy director for research. He held a variety of senior jobs. I don't know what he was at that moment. And they apparently, I should go interview Roberts again about this. I've talked to him, but I never got perfectly the answer. But they couldn't come to an agreement. My understanding is Roberts' basic message was, I have a $100 million a year military communications research project. We should think about security. But Roberts didn't want to support any secret work, and Rosenblum didn't want to do anything else. So Roberts goes back to his office in Roslyn, and Roberts has this job where PIs come by with their hats in their hands, have to listen to whatever he wants to talk about. And that week he was talking about network security. And John McCarthy came by, and John McCarthy found it interesting and came back out to the lab and chatted us up about network security, which at the time we didn't distinguish really from cryptography. Right now we'd see they're entirely different. Cryptographers have made the mistake of solving their part of the problem, right? But the rest of it is in rotten shape. But in any event, several people got interested. In particular, Hans Moravec, who's now head of the was head of the robotics lab at CMU, and he wrote a program a cryptographic program following some ideas from John McCarthy, and his is the first instance I know of what we later fought a lot about under the name key escrow. He put in a trap door for remembering the password because he thought his boss might want to encrypt something that he would want to understand. But even other people went back to working on artificial intelligence and other such things in a couple of weeks, and 6 months later I was working on nothing but cryptography. And John was fed up to his back teeth because I was being supported by under-the-table money from NSA to work on proof of correctness. And I had just, I think I was by then 26, thought I could get away without the draft getting me.
Yes.
And took an indefinite leave of absence. It turned out to last only a year. I got a check and a letter of termination a year later, but I went off traveling, intending to travel around the world. Actually, never got beyond the East Coast. And in this, I went around, visiting, digging up rare manuscripts in libraries, talking to anybody who wanted to talk, and thinking about this problem. In this process, right, the most important thing is that I met my wife, with whom I traveled for a couple of years. We originally met in a hardware store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She had a squirrel in her pocket and I was buying cage wire. And we discovered we were both keepers of exotic animals. And I'm ashamed to say I thought of her at that time as an appendage of her husband. Her husband was a mathematician. And so there was a key incident where a few days before I left town for the West Coast, I called their apartment and she answered and I said, "Hi, is Richard there?" or something. And she took me to task and said, Whit, I may not be as smart as Richard or Richard Chopin or you, but you could treat me decently. And I was humiliated. And it was another 2 years before I saw her. right? And I was on my best behavior.
Right.
And that persisted through another year or half or something went by before I was wandering around the country, and I wandered in on the two of them in New Jersey. And as I say, I was still on my best behavior, and I got more than I bargained for, and we ran off together, and we just couldn't separate
For life.
years. Yeah, right. Right.
So there you were wandering about.
So, and one of the things, my boss at MITRE was a man named Roland Silver, who was one of the neglected. He didn't communicate well. His genius was not understood. He understood structured programming a decade before that was made famous by other people. And his son, was a man named David Silver, took Mary and me down to Yorktown Heights to meet a man named Alan Tritter, who was a very famous telephone hacker and who called himself the biggest man in computer science. He weighed 500 pounds. He was bigger than Joel Moses, who was later head of a department at electrical engineering at MIT. And he introduced me, his boss, Alan Conheim. And Conheim was very secretive. He only told me one thing. Since then, wished he hadn't said that. He said, "You should look up my old friend Marty Hellman when you get out to Stanford. He was around here. He's interested in the subject too." I couldn't tell him anything either, but two people can work on a problem better than one. So I came out.
He said that. He said two people can work on a problem
Better than one, right. This is something an NSA people would never have introduced me to somebody. They understood that very well.
Right.
But Alan Conheim was still fundamentally a scientist, no matter how much he was mixed up with spooky stuff. So in any event, I came out here, and Marty, and I'm sure you've heard this from his side, the two fit fairly well, but not per. At 4:30, he graciously granted me a half an hour at 4:30 sometime or the other. And Mary and I, in the small world, we were staying with Les Lamport up in Oakland. Les Lamport won the Turing Award 2 years before I did. And we drove down here, and Mary took the car and went off and called back at 6 or something like that. And Marty and I were still talking, and Marty had invited us to dinner. And we, as family, and we accepted, and as family, we just got along wonderfully. Marty's wife and his mother-in-law bred dogs, and Mary could recognize hundreds of breeds of dog at a glance, and we just, got along fabulously. And Marty and I worked together for the next 4 years and became a great pain in Alan Conheim's ample tush.
Well, you were pain in a lot of tushes, probably.
Well, maybe, but Conheim was the subject, was regretted introducing the two of us, I suspect.
So clearly you're clicking at intellectual levels as well as personal levels.
Yes, no.
And what is...
Well, no, each of us explicitly found the other person, the most knowledgeable person of cryptography he'd yet found who was willing to talk. Right, we'd run into people we believed knew a lot, but who wouldn't talk much about it. But the two of us were just entirely open with each other. We knew different things, and we'd both been thinking about it for a year and a half or two.
And so thinking about the same problem?
No. We've been thinking about different problems. Marty Hellman was an information theorist, and he had been thinking largely in terms of moving on from Shannon's great paper, actually of 1949, but 45, but actually published in 1949. And so what he'd been doing was mostly information theoretic thinking. I had been working in some sense from an historical point of view. That is the main thing I read. I did read some technical things, but the most important thing I read was David Kahn's book, The Codebreakers. And as I told you, I read slowly. The book's 1,100 pages long, but it took me more than a year to read it.
But you got through it.
And what I was thinking about over this period of time was what the requirements for a cryptographic system were. What did we expect a cryptographic system to do? And so in that sense, I thought a lot in terms, I've persisted in this line of thinking and said it to classes that I've taught, that we have three things here. We have theory, we have application, and we have culture. And the culture is very important because unlike things in which, loosely speaking, anybody with the energy, intelligence, and so forth can go into physics and have access to the results of experiments in physics. So much of cryptography is secret that it's very hard to get the feel of what's really going on. So the point, history was the best I had for learning what really faced cryptographers as opposed to what somebody, Shannon, for example, was a brilliant expositor as well as a brilliant thinker, but he leads his readers down a garden path toward what he understands, right? Which is not necessarily what it was like in real, both cryptographic, constructing systems, and cryptanalytic environments.
So Marty is not considering this a ridiculous diversion from the point. He's seeing what you're saying.
Oh yeah, I think I don't. That you should ask him that, but he.
Well, he stuck it out with you. So
well, he fairly quickly began to support me a small bit, and then he engineered getting him into graduate school because that was a cheaper way of being supported.
Right.
I mean, all the finances were taxed to pay the graduate student research assistantships.
Right.
So if you get a research assistantship, in some sense, that's free.
But you blew graduate school too.
Well, yeah, and I spent 4 years and took 4 courses and wrote 4 papers.
So you didn't wind up getting your PhD?
I didn't wind up getting a master's degree. The alumni register politely shows me as having, quote, graduated in 1978. That's when they lost track of me.
But you're still at Stanford. Other forms of support are...
Well, so what other forms of support? One, I had been paid, after all, for 5 or 7 years as though I were a man supporting a woman in the structure of the world at that time. And I wasn't until the very end of this. 2, I had an inheritance from my mother, which Mary and I used to buy an apartment building in Berkeley. So I was landlording it up in Berkeley. I was doing, maintaining my own cars as well as the house and things like that. And a lot of what I did at Stanford was work in the design shop of mechanical engineering. So I learned a certain amount of machining while I was at Stanford, more than I learned electrical engineering.
So help me get you to the point where you changed the world together with Marty.
All right. Well, I mean, this, like all of these things in my view, has certain complexity, and one is the subtle influence of Ralph Merkle. And Ralph Merkle, I wrote a history of this called The First 10 Years of Public Key Cryptography, and I said now enters the most imaginative person in the public key saga. And Ralph Merkle had seen a lot of this as a student at Berkeley. He was taking a course with somebody whose name now slips my mind, but I wish I remembered it, because somebody wrote that about DNA, that if Rosalind Franklin had gotten along, I want to say Maurice Wilkes, but that's wrong. It's a similar sounding British name, who was the head of the laboratory she was in at King's College, I think, maybe. That Watson and Crick would just be a minor footnote in the history of public key. Similarly, if Ralph Merkle's professor had understood him, Marty Hellman and Whit Diffie would be a minor footnote in this subject.
Wonderful.
But
he didn't. His professor didn't.
He didn't understand. He wanted a prospectus for your term paper early in the term. Ralph wrote a prospectus about this, and he didn't understand it, and he asked to have it rewritten, and he didn't understand it again, and Marty and Ralph dropped the course. Ralph and I had a mutual friend who was a child was a friend of David Kahn, came from out on Long Island, and that guy's name is Peter Blackman. And so Blackman told me, Marty organized a seminar down here, and I was driving Blackman down from Berkeley to it and so forth. And Blackman was very interested in cryptography. And Blackman said to me that he had a friend who was working on a problem of secure communication between people who had no contact prior contact with each other. And I thought I had persuaded him it couldn't be done. Turns out, I think he clammed up because he knew how Ralph proposed to do it, but he didn't know whether he was supposed to tell me. So
Right,
he did.
fair enough.
In a sense, fortunately for me, he didn't. And so I thought I persuaded him it couldn't be done, but I went back to thinking about it. And 2 weeks or so after that, I had, well, let me go back a long way again.
Sure.
Sorry. There's a critical point. There are two problems, and I found one solution to two problems. In 1965, I was walking with a friend named Bill Mann, whose career was dominated by having gotten an NSA clearance about that time to work for somebody, and then everybody he went to work for found that so valuable that he was in with such a good customer. As I said, that played a very large role in his career. But even Mann told me mistakenly that NSA encrypted the telephones in its own building. Well, it barely, if at all, did at that time. They don't much do it now. They just have a separate telephone system, a separate set of pipes. But I began wondering what that meant, because my conception of security would be that I call you, nobody else in the world can possibly understand what we're talking about. So any of the techniques that I now see as of obvious value to an institution that would protect it from outside intruders, but would concentrate trust in certain organizations inside, that was a non-starter for me. So I began thinking about that. When I got to Stanford in the end of 1970, John McCarthy went off to Bordeaux and gave a paper on what we would now call internet commerce. He called it buying and selling things to a home terminal. And the French must have loved it, because his concept at the time was very much like the French Minitel system. He didn't imagine personal computers. And so I listened to this and I thought, well, how are we going to run a paperless office without signatures? Because we depend on the uniqueness of signatures, and you can always copy a digital object perfectly. So I had these two problems in my mind, one for 75, one's 5 years old, and one's 10 years old. And I was this third element here, independently. There were two authentication phenomena that I knew about. One is called identification friend or foe. And Mary, it turned out, had old friends in Cambridge, one of whom had been working for Horst Feistel in the Air Force Cambridge Research Center on identification friend or foe. And I had gotten a long way with him because I'd figured out that must be what he was working on, and he was very taken aback when I said it. Well, I knew that problem, and what that protects you against in modern terms is shoulder surfing. Somebody's listening to the transaction by which your identity is established, and they should not be able to acquire the information to engage in such a transaction. The other one is what was done, is now most famous in Unix, but it goes back further than that. That was developed by the Maurice Wilkes, whom I named, and it's the right name for another topic. He was at Cambridge. And that's what's called a one-way cipher. So I take a password and I encrypt it in a way that you can't get back, and it gets into the thing that's in the password table is a one-way cipher. So I wanted to do both things at once. And that's what led me to the notion we now call a digital signature, or that I called a digital signature when I discovered it. I realized there could be a problem. You could recognize the answer as correct without being able to solve the problem. And Marty, lit up on that immediately. He called it he immediately came up with a trapdoor quiz problem. The professor gives a problem at the beginning of the hour, and you work on it for 50 minutes, and in the last 10 minutes he explains the solution, right, after you've handed in your papers. And that's because he cooked up the problem in such a way that it has this solution. And then it was about a week later, and I've lost the dates of these things, so I still think they're somewhere in my papers, but I can't find them. But they're not on any of my computer files because I knew how important they were, and I was keeping my files on the computer of the Artificial Intelligence Lab. We were living at John McCarthy's house taking care of his 13-year-old daughter who needed caring for only because she couldn't drive. Right? When he was off in Japan having a sabbatical. So he had a home terminal at the time, and I was connected thereby to the computer at the laboratory 2 miles away or so in the hills.
Right.
So I had a much more modern environment then, than 99.9% of the people. Would now be commonplace. I was keeping my files on the computer, and knew perfectly well the computer wasn't secure. And I came across, understand that the key negotiation could be done between people who hadn't encountered each other before. I realized for the first time I had something really important.
Wow.
And so I was sure I wrote that on paper, but I didn't write it on the computer. So I don't know exactly when it happened. But it's, sometime, it was certainly one of the inspirations was the release of DES, which is the 17th of either February or March of 75. And then that's one thing that led me to thinking about what we now call trapdoor crypto systems. I thought, oh my gosh, they must know, they can't let it be broken. That would be too big a black eye. They can't let out a system they can't break. There must be, and I had this notion of how you'd have a space of systems and only a tiny fraction of them are secure, and if you change a secure one you get an insecure one, and a whole bunch of things that may or may not be true of DES. If they are, we haven't discovered anything like that, but got thinking about how you would construct such an object.
The dynamic of collaboration, because the two of you wind up writing the definitive paper. Is it just because you are trying out ideas with each other? And
well, here's a point at which our memories differ a little bit.
Okay.
So, so this afternoon that I've described to you, whose exact date I have lost, it's mid-afternoon. I remember distinctly, I had this idea. I felt I needed a Coke. I went downstairs to the refrigerator. On the way downstairs, I was thinking about something. What was it? And then fortunately, I remembered it again. Right? And that Mary was working in San Francisco, contributing a lot to our support, working as a micro picker for British Petroleum. She was fundamentally an archaeologist, and the two skills, looking for foraminifera and stuff, is the same apparently basic kind of skill as recognizing potsherds. But she came home, and I explained this to her, and I served her dinner. And then I went downhill because Marty's house right downhill from John McCarthy's house. The little passages up the hill. So it's a half-mile drive around, but it's a 50-yard walk upstairs. And it took me a while to explain it to Marty. My recollection is something like 45 minutes before it's interesting to me, now that we know it can be done, we can explain it to people by, make people believe in it by force of personality in 30 seconds or something. Right. But when we didn't, when we hadn't seen it yet, it was, John McCarthy was the only person who understood it real quickly. Right? And now I don't know if this one was being honest, but I think so. I don't think he would have known about this. But Jim Simons, the world's best paid mathematician, I explained it to him, and it took him a little while to understand it. And I tried to explain it to a man named Arthur Levinson, but I think Levinson's probably Levinson wasn't being entirely open. Levinson probably did know about it. Anyway, so John McCarthy understood it quickly. Nobody else I experienced seemed to understand it quickly. And Marty Hellman took about 45 minutes, and as I recall it, he then said, I have an invitation from Jim Massey to contribute a paper to a special edition on cryptography of the transactions and information theory. Would you join me in it? Now, Marty doesn't remember it that way. He said he would never have, he thought other things we'd done, he couldn't have written a paper honestly and not included me prior to this business. But nonetheless, that's how I remember it. And so I like this connection very much because later Jim Massey was at the ETH in Zurich, and he got hot under the collar when he discovered that Stanford hadn't given me a doctorate for this work. Right? which is because the electrical engineering department requires a whole lot of courses and things like that.
Oh, that.
Right. Marty had this vision of my becoming an all but courses. Right. Most people are all but dissertation. I didn't see a problem with the dissertation. It was all but the courses. But I see Jim Massey in a very fundamental sense as one of my two advisors, because Jim Massey commissioned and published the paper that's effectively my doctoral thesis.
Right. The overarching
Yes.
questions of security and privacy that has been so important to you as you've thought about your work.
Okay. Well, so one big inspiration, and this runs back into the late 60s, is that I saw privacy as very important, and I had this vision of time as somewhat like a saddle curve. So as you go forward in time, I thought we were on a fairly flat piece at that time. We're walking along a ridge, and it's going to get sharper and sharper and sharper, and roughly speaking, one side's good and one side's bad. And that we're likely to fall off on one side or the other. I don't claim I would see it that way now. But I saw the threats to privacy as being tremendous. And we were working, the Artificial Intelligence Lab was a quarter or something the size of the Multics project, which is the most important thing ever done in operating systems. Most ambitious project ever undertaken in operating systems. Some fraction of it emerges into the world as Unix, but Multics itself died off. But Multics had very elaborate security mechanisms, and you could attach all sorts of labels and restrictions and things to files. I don't know them comprehensively. I just remember that fact of it. And my reasoning was that wasn't any good for what I was thinking about, because I had a very anti-establishment viewpoint, right? And
What a surprise.
what?
What a surprise.
And I figured, well, the system, I didn't think of the distinction with the system. Now we distinguish systems programmers and operators very sharply, but I still know all of a mess of people. System programmers aren't going to go to jail to protect your data. They get a subpoena for your data, they're going to hand it over, right? And the only thing I saw as being any good is you could encrypt it. And if it were properly encrypted, right, then somebody could get it, but they wouldn't be able to figure it out. And of course, we're still fighting about that 40 years later, 50 years later. But I tried at that era to persuade a variety of people to work on. I thought I was working on something more important, and in a sense I was. I think that problem is more important. But I tried to persuade people to work on cryptography. My view was that the government knew a lot about cryptography, that it wasn't going to tell us what it knew, and that we needed to get it out by rediscovering it. And I thought that could be done, and in fact, Roland Silver was pessimistic. They're a bunch of rather smart guys. He knew more of them at the time than I do. But in retrospect, the big problem, yes, there are subtle mathematical things that they know, but there's also, the real problem is running into the questions. And if you're not faced with actually designing crypto systems that are going to go into battle, so to speak, or if you're not actually faced with intercepted traffic, which is very expensive to acquire, right? Not only is it by and large illegal for the two of us to intercept people's traffic, but most of NSA's budget goes for wiretaps and antennas and satellites and things like that around the world that are picking up traffic, and for vast libraries of tape at the time that record all this data and the indexes that allow you to get at them. And so if you don't have it's hard to understand the problems just by thinking about them from the outside. So that's why it was, a whole lot of what's secret there is still secret, because it just hadn't occurred to other people to think about it. Anyway, I tried to persuade a variety of people to think about this. The most important, in my view, is a woman named Harriet Fell, who also went to high school with me and is a much better mathematician than I am. Another one of my few candidates I have, people whose the ratio of whose abilities to achievements, are so tremendously high, even though her achievements are hardly negligible. I mean, she retired as a full professor at Northeastern, having moved from mathematics into computer science. But, which reminds me that you asked me how I got into computer science, and the brief answer is because I was dodging the draft. So I took a job I couldn't get into graduate school, so I took a job at MITRE, which was systems engineering consultant to the Air Force, and that got me a deferment. And that introduced me to something that would have been below, I was like Einstein, being willing to examine patents or something. I mean, I just did computing. I didn't think of that. In a vague sense, still don't think of that as in a class with mathematics. But I subsequently became very interested and believe it was very important.
Again, one of those questions that may or may not be interesting. At this point, if you were in your 20s, where would you invest your intellectual energy?
Oh, probably in biology. I mean, I would think that, I think computer science, will expand a millionfold over what it is today. That's a perfectly reasonable place to spend your effort. I can point to interesting problems in cryptography. I mean, this proof of correctness of everything problem is still a very interesting problem. Whether it is now the right time to work on it, I don't know. Right? I mean, there are two issues about what to work on, one of which is hard to see as a young researcher, which is what is really ripe. It's easy in some sense to see what's interesting, particularly to you, but seeing what exactly is the right thing to be worked on at that moment, where the tools, that requires breadth of knowledge that doesn't typically emerge till later in your life. And so, but looking with that alleged breadth of knowledge that, of course, older people, I would say, my gosh, I mean, computer science is immensely interesting, but the thing that's really going to change the world is biology, genetics, development, all of that sort of thing.
What about the intersection between?
Well, of course the intersections. The way to make progress is to work along the intersections of things. And I was telling that to somebody in London, or a discussion with a child or something like that, and that person knew something about something else that I find amusing. I said to him that I thought that general relativity was the perfect example of how God makes it up as the physicists go along. Because Einstein worked on something called the Prague theory, and he couldn't solve the boundary value problems. So he folded the universe up to get rid of the boundary, and that's why we live in a universe without a boundary. If Einstein had been smarter, we'd have a boundary to the universe. He would have figured out the boundary. And I don't entirely, of course, that sounds like nonsense. And, since I think it's nonsense, how do I know? It's above my pay grade or something.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.